If you get a bad grade, for instance, for whatever reason, let's say you studied really well, but you focused on the wrong parts, or in the moment you interpreted that question in a different way. Now you've got to determine, what does this mean? Now, let's say you have a growth mindset and you're able to understand that you don't always get perfect grades. And actually, when you're falling short, it's an opportunity to try to invest more time and learn better and actually do better next time. And so when you have that belief, you're more likely to talk to your teachers, to talk to your parents, to try to sit back down and wrestle with the problem so you can understand what you did wrong so you can do it better next time. And your chances of doing better the next time are better compared to someone with a fixed mindset who, upon getting a bad grade, concludes that this is evidence that I'm not smart enough, I shouldn't bother. And so they're going to study a little bit less, which means that they're less likely to do well on that subsequent test. That one initial setback, depending on how you interpret it, starts to create these divergent paths where it invests more, and that next outcome becomes more positive, which then reinforces your initial belief that this isn't a sign that I can't do this. In contrast, someone who does believe that this is a sign that I can't do this, disengages, studies less, does more poorly, and now they have more concrete evidence in their hands because they've done more poorly, which reconfirms their initial belief that I can't do this.
That's Dr. Omid Fotuhi, PhD and researcher in the field of social psychology, describing how our interpretation of challenges can affect behavior and outcomes, which in turn reinforce our mindset and, for better or worse, lead to long-term consequences. Dr. Fotuhi shares what he's learned from his research about the power of mindset and how to harness it for performance and well-being.
You're listening to the Be a Good Wheel podcast, the show where we explore what it means to be a good wheel by digging into scientific research and personal stories about human potential and performance. I'm your host, Amber Pierce.
Today, we get to speak with Dr. Omid Fotuhi, a visionary psychologist, educator, and a leading researcher in the science of resilience and growth mindset. Dr. Fotuhi is widely known for his innovative research, which goes beyond traditional studies to address real-life applications. As he's discovered in his work, simply knowing about growth mindset is one thing, but cultivating it as a personal and professional tool is quite another. Dr. Fotuhi has pioneered practical frameworks that help individuals internalize this mindset, transforming resilience from a buzzword to a lived experience. Throughout his career, Dr. Fotuhi has been involved in multiple groundbreaking initiatives aimed at integrating psychological research with on-the-ground educational programs. He has conducted research with the World Health Organization, Stanford University, and is the Director of Learning Innovation at WGU Labs and a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Fotuhi's expertise in social science, behavioral economics, leadership, and performance optimization has made him a renowned thought leader on motivation and performance. His initiatives have helped thousands of people, from students to CEOs, to redefine their relationship with learning and failure. A passionate educator at heart, Dr. Fotuhi also brings his expertise into university classrooms, teaching students how to apply the principles of growth mindset and resilience in their everyday lives. He has also designed and implemented programs that empower educators to foster these mindsets in their students, helping shape school cultures and environments. Dr. Fotuhi's career includes collaborations with some of the most renowned thinkers in psychology, including the esteemed Dr. Carol Dweck, whose pioneering research first brought the concept of growth mindset to the world stage. Whether you want to navigate a recent setback, improve your approach to learning, or find ways to be more adaptable in an ever-changing world, Dr. Fotuhi offers a practical guide on how we can foster resilient mindsets in our own lives and in those around us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Omid, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here. I'm really excited to be able to pick your brain and your expertise on this incredible topic of growth mindset, which I think is wildly beneficial, especially to athletes, but really to anyone in any walk of life. And before we dig into that, I think it makes sense to establish some good definitions. So let's start out with a basic one. What is mindset in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think people sort of take it for granted that our brains are these super computers processing more information than we can even fathom, in terms of the visual, the audio, the sensory, but even some of the subtle information that we have to manage and digest, like social cues, the pressures of work, the how to prioritize, how to experience and process feelings. there's a lot going on all of the time. And so one way of thinking about mindset is that essentially what they are convenient interpretations for the experiences that we have, both internal and external. Essentially, it's the stories we come up with to explain the events in our lives. That's kind of the most general way of talking about mindsets. And where they're useful is because they do help to create efficiencies in the way that we process information. Because absent mindsets, absent these sort of convenient heuristics, we would be processing a lot more information all of the time, which would actually be debilitating because we would never really have a sense of confidence about what the things in our lives mean. So, simply said, mindsets are kind of these like simple shortcut heuristics or explanations about the things in our lives.
That's really, I love that. I love that explanation. And this makes a lot of sense. One of the things we've talked about on the show before is in sport, anytime you're learning a new sport, beginners tend to pay attention to too many things. There's just so much stimulus happening all around them, and they're really trying to take it all in. They haven't learned what to prioritize and what they can get away with not paying attention to. And then the more expert they become more efficient at learning what they don't have to pay attention to and focusing their attention on the things that actually matter. And that seems like kind of what you're getting at with mindset. Is that an accurate representation?
Yeah, that's a really great beginning sort of position, which is to say that when you're starting off, that's exactly right. Everything is still so new that you're in the beginnings of trying to formulate and create new mindsets. But as you get more experience, as you're able to sort of over time see the pattern within the noise, then that's kind of the beginnings of a mindset. So you tend to filter out the non-essential cues or signals, and you focus on kind of the overall, interpretation of what it is that means. So, for instance, if you're first time running and you're out of breath, it's actually a really powerful experience to be out of breath when your heart is beating really quickly, you're sweating, you're struggling to get enough oxygen. It can actually be kind of a stressful experience. And so in that moment, you have to decide, what does this physiological arousal mean about what I'm doing and how I'm going to do? And the first time you experience that, chances are it might be a little bit unnerving. It might be a little bit stressing because it's such a powerful experience that you don't have a precedent for. But if you're on a soccer team or any kind of sports, sort of team, then you become pretty acquainted with this experience over time. And then so you start to worry about it less. And if you associate that experience with something positive, like training, like exercise, like racing, that also has a positive outcome, now your brain is connecting that physiological experience to that positive outcome. So that's a great example of mindset. Now, one thing I'll say, and I think the reason why you and I are here talking about mindsets is that we're not interested just in these general interpretations of when it is that our minds make assumptions about the experiences in our lives. But we're more interested specifically in moments where things are not going well, when things seem to be, you're struggling and you're just uncertain about the outcome. And so that's when mindset actually becomes really predictive. So like when things are going really well, mindset doesn't really matter. It's not really that predictive. So like, let's say you're, at the front of the pack in a race, or you're doing a training routine and you're in that state of flow because your body is actually equipped enough and ready enough to engage in that exercise. Everything seems to be going well. But where mindset actually becomes critical and where we want to try to focus on is when things are either really novel or really hard, or you're not doing as well as you'd like to. That's where mindset becomes really, really useful to think about, because these interpretations that we have about the meaning of events also determine your behavior. So let's go back to that example of when I'm breathing heavily, my heart rate is sort of at a very high rate, I'm sweating, and I'm running, for instance, as part of a training program. If I feel that this is actually normal part of the running, and I feel like this is something that I can maintain, then I won't be discouraged by those physiological cues. My mindset tells me that I can do this. But in that same example, if I have the same physiological experiences, and now instead of saying that I can do this, and this is a sign that I'm like exercising well, my mind interprets that as, hey, well, you're not fast enough. And that's why your body is struggling. all of a sudden a mindset comes in to make an interpretation that is harmful, which actually causes you to slow down. It causes you to feel discouraged. It causes you to be anxious about moments when you have those same physiological experiences. So when things are going well, mindsets are great, but they're not predictive of your behavior. It's only when things are actually kind of challenging and uncertain and you're struggling and you start to wonder about the associated outcome with that experience, that's when mindsets become really useful. And in particular, I think why we're talking about all of this is the fact that there's a certain level of experiences that we have that are just kind of like normal day-to-day, non-deterministic kinds of behaviors. Like if you wake up in the morning and you have breakfast, mindset doesn't really matter there either, right? But it's when the stakes are high. It's when the stakes are high and when we're in competitive domains, that's where you see the science of mindset actually being really useful. Because, if all things being equal, let's say imagine that you're on a lineup for a track race, right? And you look around and everyone's kind of ready to go. The gun goes off and you're the only person to take off. Everybody else is kind of like still there because they didn't take off with a gun. Now, what are the chances of you winning compared to other people? That's pretty good, right? Because you've taken off earlier. And if the only difference is that you understand what that signal of the gun means and others interpret it slightly differently, here's an example of where mindset might set you at an advantage and others at a disadvantage. So mindset, again, also becomes really important in competitive domains because if all things being equal, you have that more adaptive mindset that allows you to stay engaged, that allows you to take action, that allows you to take initiative, that allows you to stay persistent with long-term endeavors, then over time, you will have a physiological advantage as well. So that was kind of like a little bit of context setting for like what mindset is and why it matters in these particular domains, which I think is a really great context to start the conversation.
Yeah. Oh, this is great. So I love this idea because this isn't something I've ever really explicitly thought about, but I have absolutely experienced, which is that mindset is really, really useful when the stakes are high and when things feel uncertain or like they're not going your way. I haven't ever really thought about how mindset might affect me eating breakfast and how that's not as relevant, but you're absolutely right. And that definition helps so much. I think one thing that would be really useful to talk about as we dig into this is how much control do we have over mindset? Because I can imagine that mindset as this filter that helps us interpret patterns and determine, isolate the signal from the noise would be adaptive, right? So like from an evolutionary standpoint, that would be it would be a competitive advantage. It makes sense that we would evolve to have this mindset to help us gain this efficiency. How much of this is under our conscious control versus unconscious control? Is this something that just happens automatically, or how much control do we have over creating or adapting our own mindsets?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it sort of taps into the broader question of like, where do mindsets come from? Which I think is a really great question. As I mentioned earlier, mindsets are kind of these convenient interpretations about the events in our lives, both internal and external. And you can't assume that you can just make up mindsets. Like you can't just say that I'm going to believe that, the sky is yellow and I'm the best. Well, that's just how it is. Like you can't really do that. If you did, then I think you'd have a different kind of set of problems. And the reason is that, mindset are actually, again, are sort of the accumulation of experiences in addition to an adding in or filling of the gaps where there isn't explicit data on. So, and that's usually where the internal stuff comes in. So like from an external perspective, let's say you're competing and you're not thinking about anything that's happening internally, your body will perform at a certain level. And so how you perform becomes part of how it is that you form that mindset about your performance. So like, just imagine that I could just turn off your brain and only program it to do as best as you can. Even if I did that relative to other people, you may or may not be at the top of the race or the outcomes. And then once you've accomplished that, especially over repeated times, then your brain will say, okay, on average, I come in the top third. So that becomes part of your mindset about your performance. However, our brains have two things to also manage and navigate. One is there's a lot of missing information in general. And the other is how it is that we experience and process the internal experiences and data that come. So like if you're if you're feeling like you're breathing hard, how hard are you breathing? That's where a mindset comes in to answer that question. How hard are you breathing? Are you breathing too hard? Are you not breathing enough, hard enough? Or are you breathing just at the optimal level? Those are the areas where there's ambiguity when some mindsets come in and play a deterministic factor. Now, as I mentioned, so mindsets are largely driven by external sources. So how you do, but they're also driven by the kind of social cues and the social values that we're immersed in, right? So for example, to kind of really take a big step back, imagine when you were a child, or if you have a child, and first time that your child walks, what do you do as a parent? You get really excited and you clap. You say, yay, you're walking. Now, luckily, here's a really great example, actually. Even if you didn't successfully get up and walk that first time, let's say you stumbled, you fell, and it didn't go well. At no point did your parents look at each other and say, you know what? This one's just not going to walk. Like that's actually, it seems like a simplistic example, but in their minds, because they've seen that almost everybody in the world can walk, they have a deeply rooted mindset that you, as their child, will also walk. And so if you fall, they don't just give up on you. They keep encouraging you because internal to themselves, they hold this unshakable belief that you will walk. And so there's an example of where someone's mindset kind of impacts your behavior and your outcome. Because if you had fallen and your parents didn't believe that you could walk, you might actually not be as motivated. You wouldn't get as much encouragement that signals to you that there is a strong belief that you can do this. So there's an example of where mindsets are externally driven.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful.
And these things go on because then we go into schooling. Like our school then tells us that how you do based on grades is what matters. Then you get into a job and what you do is based on salary. That's the outcome that you're striving towards, or promotions. That's the outcomes and so where it sort of unfortunately is that disadvantages us is where we start to no longer hold that true belief that everybody has the potential to achieve great things like walking. This begins as soon as essentially we start walking, where we go into school and where we go into work, where there's a relative comparative context that pits us against one another. And the underlying assumption is that some are better than others. And that those that are good are going to be rewarded by good grades. They're going to be rewarded by promotions. They're going to be rewarded by big salaries. And implicitly, what that's telling us is if we're not getting the good grades, if we're not getting the high salary and the promotions, then that gives us an implicit understanding of kind of where we think we stand relative to others in society. And so that's another example of where mindsets are informed based on the cues and the signals from the environment. Actually, Mary Murphy has a great book that touches on the contextual factors that impact our mindsets. It's called Cultures of Growth. And she actually lays out from an external perspective, there are four main categories or four main triggers of mindsets that when you encounter, you have to make the determination of what does this mean? And you can interpret that in various ways. But before we get that, I feel like it might also be useful just to do a quick reminder of the basic mindset work from Carol Dweck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I had the great fortune of working closely at Stanford with some of the mindset researchers and pioneers, including Carol Dweck.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, it was such a privilege. And what was really fascinating is to see up close the genesis of a lot of the work that motivated and stimulated their body of research. And with Carol, when we speak with her, she tells us that when she first was interested in this topic, she began by just observing some relatively young children, I think, ages, 8 and 9, in observation where the initial experiment was actually on learned helplessness. And so the study was designed to create a context or a situation where students were given such an impossibly difficult task that it was intended to discourage them. It was intended to make them feel like, okay, I just can't do this. So what does that mean in terms of like the sense of hopelessness and helplessness that I might have to navigate? And what she found was actually something quite surprising, is that when she had these young kids come into the lab, she gave them this really, really hard set of questions to do. And there was a subgroup of these kids who, as predicted, when they got these really difficult questions to complete, they got discouraged. They're like, this is
Mhm.
not possible. Why bother? I'm just not going to do this. But there was a smaller subgroup that surprisingly, when they got hard questions, instead of getting deflated, instead of getting discouraged, instead of getting upset and frustrated, they actually got excited. They
Huh.
actually got enthused. They were like, oh my goodness, this is so hard and challenging. We were really hoping that we would learn something new today. We were really hoping that we could stretch ourselves today by doing something that we hadn't done. And this was the observation that really caught Carol's attention, which was that in the face of the same challenges, depending on what your underlying belief is about the meaning of your ability to meet the demands of the expectations, you will either shrink and get discouraged, or you'll rise up to the situation and get encouraged by the difficulty. Now, fast forward some 30, 40 years of research, and she's found like consistently at the heart of that difference between when individuals get discouraged and disengaged versus get encouraged and engage is the underlying belief of what it is that the nature of intelligence or ability is all about. And ultimately, the two groups that she was able to identify are those who have what's known as a fixed mindset. And so when you ask them, what is ability or intelligence? They'll say that ability and intelligence are these qualities that some people or traits that some people have more or less of, and you can't really change it. That you're kind of like you're born with this level of intelligence or born with this level of ability, and over time it'll sort of grow with your genetic potential. But there will be a difference between individuals in terms of how much they can expect to be smart or to have these innate abilities. The other group that she asks, and especially those who responded more enthusiastically about the nature of intelligence and ability, actually said that we believe that intelligence and ability are not these fixed traits. What they are is they're these malleable qualities that you can practice and strengthen over time. And when you encounter difficulties, that actually is a great example of when you are able to strengthen those abilities even more. There's a whole bunch of research, and that group is called the growth mindset group. There's a whole bunch of research consistently showing that when things get hard, those with a fixed mindset interpret that difficulty as a signal that maybe they can't do this, because for them, what they're motivated by is to come across as seeming like they're smart or come across as seeming like they're talented. And so when something is challenging, something is hard, then they start to wonder, like, if I'm smart and if I'm like really good, then why is this hard?
Mm-hmm.
And the only conclusion that they have is, well, maybe it's because I can't do this. Maybe it's because I'm not smart. Maybe it's because I'm not talented. And so the conclusion is actually quite rational. Like if you believe that intelligence and ability are these innate fixed traits and you encounter something difficult, then the conclusion that you can't do this is not irrational. But if you believe that you can grow and you can strengthen, then when you encounter something difficult, that actually is a very different conclusion, which is to say that this is something I haven't done yet. And so how do I exert more effort to strengthen myself in these domains? So those are the general categories of the growth and fixed mindset that Dr. Carol Dweck has pioneered. And I think those become the basis for, again, a lot of the conversations that you have and we have these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is incredible. There's so much to unpack here. One of the things that you said just at the very beginning there was you were talking about little kids learning to walk. And I have a toddler now, so I had the pleasure of watching her learn how to walk. And it was funny to me watching her learn how to walk, because I would watch her. Yeah, she would stumble. It took a while. She finally got it. And as she was going through this process, I would kind of laugh to myself, because as an adult, there are so many things that, I would try to learn how to do. And as I would stumble or not quite get it right, I would get so down on myself and be like, oh, you idiot, why can't you just do this? And then I would watch my daughter learning to walk and I would think, it would be so ludicrous for her to think to herself, oh, I'm such an idiot. Like, I bet the baby across the street is already walking by now. So I was thinking about that, like from an internal perspective, like her internal mindset versus my internal mindset. I didn't think about the fact that her internal mindset might be cueing off from my belief that she can walk, which is really powerful. And that just was very eye-opening for me. And then the other piece of this is just talking about the growth versus fixed mindset. This is absolutely something that I've experienced myself. I feel like I've experienced both growth mindset and fixed mindset, and it's been kind of a dynamic thing. Given these two mindsets, and before I say this next thing, I want to say, you had mentioned before that mindset when applied in an uncertain environment of high stakes, is deterministic of behavior. And when you describe growth and fixed mindset, that really makes sense, because if I believe I can't do this problem because I'm not smart enough, that mindset discourages me from trying harder. And that I see exactly how that determines a behavior change versus looking at it like, oh, maybe I need to try harder. And then that determines a behavioral outcome, which can then determine the outcome, which is super interesting. So what can we do? Because I think I don't know many people who would say like, oh, I definitely want the fixed mindset so that I'll give up on stuff. How much control do we have of this? Like, how do we foster this, or can we?
Yeah, we can. Can I just touch on something that you just mentioned that is actually pretty critical,
Please, yes.
which is that mindset typically don't just impact a single occurrence of an event. So it's not, what matters is not how your mindset predict whether you persist a little bit longer on one test. What matters is that it's the repeated application of mindset across time and many situations. Because you're right, mindsets are actually not fixed. And as we go back to the original definition of mindsets being our brain trying to make sense of the world, then there's also this recursive process. And what that means is that if you start off like a child who has no reason to doubt that they can walk, they will persist and persist and persist, in part because of the cues that they're getting from their environment, their parents, also truly believing that they can walk. There is no basis to doubt themselves at all. And so they will consistently and repeatedly try and try and try until they're able to walk. Now, fast forward into, early stage primary school, where that mindset is not as absolute, where people start to wonder if that's always the case. If you get a bad grade, for instance, for whatever reason, let's say you studied really well, but you focused on the wrong parts, or in the moment you interpreted that question in a different way. Now, for the first time, you get a bad grade. Now, you've got to determine, what does this mean? Now, let's say you have a growth mindset. And you're able to understand that you don't always get perfect grades, and actually, when you're falling short, it's an opportunity to try to invest more time and learn better and actually do better next time. And so, when you have that belief, you're more likely to talk to your teachers, to talk to your parents, to try to sit back down and wrestle with the problem, so you can understand what you did wrong, so you can do it better next time. In turn, what's going to happen is if you have that mindset, then you're going to invest the time and the strategies, and your chances of doing better the next time are better compared to someone with a fixed mindset who, upon getting a bad grade, concludes that this is evidence that I'm not smart enough, I shouldn't bother. And so they're going to study a little bit less, which means that they're less likely to do well on that subsequent test. Now, so what you see is, even though both people started off at a relatively similar place from a mindset perspective, that one initial setback, depending on how you interpret it, starts to create these divergent paths. Whereas if you believe that you stay engaged and you're not discouraged by that sort of proximal outcome, then you invest more, and that next outcome becomes more positive, which then reinforces your initial belief that this isn't a sign that I can't do this. In contrast, someone who does believe that this is a sign that I can't do this disengages, studies less, does more poorly, and now they have more concrete evidence in their hands because they've done more poorly, which reconfirms their initial belief that I can't do this. And then it becomes very, very difficult to untangle and unpack, because at that point, you have more and more evidence to support your initial beliefs. Now, you sort of compound this over years and years and years and years. And that's where you see this very solid, entrenched belief systems that create these differences between individuals. And it also creates a chronically different pattern of engagement or disengagement. So if you have many years of experience, as a result of that initial interpretation, outcome, and confirmation cycle, that you can't do this, you're not going to bother. In fact, you hear people say this all the time. One of the really most exciting or interesting examples. And by the way, we all hold different mindsets in different domains. So, for example, even though I'm a mindset researcher, I still cannot convince myself that I can sing. And unfortunately, my wife and my kids confirm this on a daily basis. But I do believe that I can be a better presenter. I do believe that I can be a better researcher. I believe I can be better runner. And so because I have those core beliefs, I actually continue to invest time and energy into those things. But one of the most vivid examples that I came across is when I worked with some student athletes, specifically around the improvement of their performance on the court.
Mm-hmm.
And this was basketball. I remember this one athlete who came to me and he's like, I want you to sort of watch as I play, and then we can talk about some strategies for me to improve. And we did very well. And so he actually, like under pressure, was able to execute some complex plays under time pressure that required some actually relatively complex mathematical computations. Like he had to make quick judgments under pressure and quick calculations to be able to execute in this team performance. So he came back and we're talking about his performance, and he was just very, very proud of how he was doing, and we were able to focus on areas of improvement. But then just from like conversation, I'm like, so how are things going otherwise? Like, how's school? And he's like, oh, I'm doing really good in this class, but I'm really struggling in math. I'm like, oh, I wonder why. He's like, well, I'm just not a math person. With that single blanket statement, he had closed off his mind that there's a possibility that he could do well in mathematics, even though the evidence on the court demonstrates that he has all of the executive functions to be able to compute complex algorithms in a very, very time-constrained way. But along the way, I imagine that he had some negative experience in mathematics. He had this certain, unfortunately, more fixed mindset attribution about what that means. And that's confirmed for him that I'm just not a math person. In fact, a couple of key words, a couple of key signals or cues when people have a fixed mindset is when they use terms like just. So I just can't do this. I just can't get this. It's just too hard. For whatever reason, that word pops in head whenever people have a fixed mindset, or when they describe themselves as a kind of person. And that this shows up either in positive perceptions or negative perception. I'm a really great, math person. I'm a really great history person. I'm a great cook. These kinds of like identity descriptions tend to be signals of these fixed mindsets. So just wanted to sort of touch on that point because it's critical to understand that the impact of mindset isn't just a single acute experience, but it accumulates over time across many instances, and it gets you to a place where it's very difficult to undo. Well, that's the challenge. So that, to your question, how do you sort of foster more of a growth mindset? How do you sort of break down these negative mindsets? It's really hard. I think it depends on if we're talking about from the individual perspective. So like if I wanted to instill a growth mindset in myself versus trying to instill it in somebody else, those are two different games. But I do think that, let's start off with, let's use an example of a parent. Because as I mentioned, these sort of mindsets are born as a response to our experiences from both external cues, but also internal cues. I remember one time I actually was giving a presentation on mindsets to a large group of faculty. And at the front of this room was this one faculty member who, more than anybody else, I'd like to think that I'm an engaging speaker, but this man was into my presentation. From the beginning, his eyes were locked on me. He seemed completely captivated by what I was trying to say, but at a level that felt so deep that it actually became uncomfortable. He was just staring at me in this deep reflective way that I'm like, something is going on here. I'm not sure that I can take full credit for what's happening. But sure enough, at the end of the presentation, I was able to get through it. He comes up to me and he says, I really wanted to thank you for that presentation. As you were speaking, it made me realize something. I'm like, what was it? He's like, I have a son. He's about 9 years old and he just started playing chess. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. How's it going? He's like, well, I thought it wasn't going well. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, just this past weekend, he had his first chess competition. And he had a lineup of matches throughout the whole day. And it was his first time competing. And I had to sit in the stands. I couldn't go and sort of cheer him on or encourage him. So he had these 4 games back to back that I could only watch from the sidelines. And what ended up happening is that I proceeded to watch him lose game after game after game in the most horrific, not even balanced way that you could imagine. And I sat there feeling crushed for my son, who must be feeling so discouraged by this experience that when he was in his 4th game, I was able to kind of come down from the stands and walk towards him. And I was ready to just embrace him and hold him and tell him that it's okay. But to my surprise, he came up to me and he had the most exuberant sense of joy and excitement. And he said, Dad, did you see those games? I got my butt kicked and by these amazing players. And it was the most wonderful thing. And in that moment, what was really powerful for him is that he, as the father, actually held a fixed mindset, that he believed that the only value of effort was to win, was the outcome. And he failed to appreciate the value of the process and the experience that is acquired when we put ourselves out there, when we exert ourselves, when we push ourselves to limits that we haven't done before. And so for him, the sort of aha moment was like, I hold a negative mindset about the meaning of challenge and competition. Specifically, that I think the only thing that matters is whether you win or not. And I realized in that moment that I might have contributed to this mindset contagion, that I might influence my son's beliefs because of the way that I see things. And in that moment, he just like broke down.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. I still get choked up because it's like, you can only imagine yourself being in that situation and realize, like, wow, like power that we have to influence other people. And so I think when you think about our roles as coaches, our roles as parents, just also realizing that a lot of that, as we've touched on, comes from the beliefs that we hold about the relative value of the outcomes that society has told us are the things that matter. That, winning is what matters, or being the top timed individual is what matters. Like, these things may matter, but they're not the entirety of what we should be focusing on. So I think, that's one kind of like paradigm for teachers, for coaches, and for parents, is to kind of reflect internally on like, what are the beliefs that I hold in terms of the meaning and the value of this endeavor? Recognizing that our kids, our students, and our athletes are picking up on the things that we think matter. So that's maybe starting off from like a general set of recommendations for parents and teachers and coaches.
That's huge. And I want to dig into this a little bit because I think this is really, really important. So with the student who was playing chess, for example, he was so moved by what he was able to learn getting his butt kicked in this tournament, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining people who are listening to this, there might be some folks, and I say this only because I've seen this kind of theme crop up a lot, especially in sport, but in pretty much any competitive or performance-oriented arena, is this idea that if you focus just on the process, right? Like, if we just give everybody a participant medal, then, who is going to feel motivated to improve? So where is the balance between appreciating the process and maybe as a parent saying, okay, well, I want my kid to appreciate the process of learning, and I want to encourage my kid to get the best grades that they can. Maybe they don't have to get straight A's, but how do I encourage them to do their best while still encouraging the process if you're not focusing on outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think there's a way of doing it. And it's actually quite succinctly described by not focusing on process, not focusing on outcome, but focusing on progress, right? Because process without progress is also useless.
Yes.
And, in the same way that outcome without progress is not really useful, right? Like, if you're, let's say, the fastest eighth grader in a second grader race, then, why are you there? Yeah, it feels great, but you're not in the right space.
It's pretty meaningless. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not useful. And so you kind of want that optimal set of conditions where you can have competition and you can strive for outcomes, but only if there's a signal of progress, right? I mean, again, unless like your livelihood depends on your particular sport, the vast majority of our conversations don't need to focus on outcomes alone. Because ultimately, as we think about our kids, our athletes, our students, we want them to learn. We want them to grow. And so I think just like this reframing around, is there progress happening now? And how do I measure that? And so I think that's kind of like the very sort of like broad blanket recommendation. So for example, let's say someone is starting to run for the first time. Running is physiologically an uncomfortable state, right? It's an uncomfortable experience. And as you're running, especially as you're starting out, like your body is out of breath and you look around and everybody else seems like they're not out of breath. So one way of interpreting that is like, I just can't run. Right. And so if the first thing that you do as a coach is to try to do a benchmark time trial, for instance, like let's say you get them to run 500 meters and you're trying to time that, then the thing that you're saying quite strongly and powerfully is that what I care about right now, even as you're starting, is that you perform relatively well from a time perspective. And so if the kid who tries this relative to everybody else who presumably is at the same or better level, doesn't do as well, now has some bit of evidence that says what matters in this context is that I do well from a time perspective and I didn't do well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imagine that same situation where a coach says, hey, I know that these kids are starting to run. And instead of even starting to think about timing or even mentioning that, they say, what I care about is that you bank 1,000 runs around this lap over the next 4 months. And once you do that, once you've done 1,000 laps around this track, then we'll start looking at how it is that we can start to improve your performance. But by then, they'll have run so many times, and the benchmark of success is not whether they did it fast, but whether they completed it a certain number of times. So now the focus is on the progress. It's on the continuous improvement and the continuous investments towards something that accumulates over time. That's what progress is. So I think that's kind of like one of the powerful ways that we can sort of recalibrate, especially when our students or kids are starting out, is to recalibrate not around sort of these like objective relative benchmarks that we compare ourselves to others, but around the effort that we put into things and the repetition and the process that leads to more clearly progress happening. Another example I think that often comes to mind is you can also, if you want to measure sort of progress and outcome, is instead of just focusing each single time on how it is that the kids do relative to each other, if you kept a log of how it is that they did across time, now you also have a different way of focusing on what progress means. It's not that you're needing to always be the best, because what actually happens is, as we all know, is in training, especially if you're training hard, even though you're progressively getting stronger, your body always feels weak. Like you always actually, if you were to ask someone, how are you feeling at the end of a training program versus at the beginning, they would actually say, I feel like I can do less than I was when I started. But that's because you put a lot of accumulations of stress and mileage and work into your body and intended to fatigue it. But that's exactly how you get stronger. But if you had a clear catalog of your performance across time, then you're able to see objectively that I am improving on these key benchmarks relative to me, right? Not relative to others, relative to me. And you can actually graph that pretty easily. It's guaranteed. Like, it's just like you can't cheat a well-designed and executed training program. If you do it faithfully across time, it's guaranteed to give you results. But people don't see that. So as a coach, our job is to show that quite clearly to the individuals to see that they are making progress. Because really at the heart of what a fixed mindset is this core belief that I just can't do this and this will never change. But if you start to accumulate evidence in contrary to that, then you show that people are getting better, they are getting faster, then they can also extrapolate into subsequent years and say, if I continue this, then this is where I'll be in about a year or 2 years, 3 years from now.
Yeah, I love this. That was actually exactly what my coach used to do for me, because I would get really discouraged and think, I've been putting on all this training, and then he would pull out the charts and he would show me, this is how your power output has been improving. This is, and that was really powerful for, and certainly like I personally, me as an individual, like I love being evidence-based and I love the data, and I can get a little too wrapped up in it, but my coach was really great about balancing that. We'll hear more from Dr. Omid Fotuhi after this quick break. We want to make this podcast financially sustainable and need your help to keep a good thing going. Sign up for a Be a Good Wheel membership on Ko-Fi and get access to extended guest interviews, bonus episodes, and Be a Good Wheel gear. Monthly memberships start as low as $3 per month. Go to ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel to join other members who are supporting the show. That's ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel. And now, back to our conversation with psychology PhD and researcher, Dr. Omid Fotuhi. I think this is a really important point to dig into here. When you're looking at this evidence, what is interesting to me is how we connect it with this idea of potential. So bear with me for a moment. Imagine we have a little timeline, and there's me 5 years ago, there's me 3 years ago, and me today. Let's say yesterday, I had the race of my life, and I performed at a level that I never believed that I possibly could, right? Like I surpassed all expectation until the day that I actually execute that performance in real life. I have no evidence for the fact that I'm capable of that is my potential. So 5 years prior to that performance, for example, I would have no evidence to indicate that that was part of my potential. And I think sometimes when we focus on this idea of potential, it's really hard to imagine what we might be capable of because we have no evidence for it until it happens. And then once that happens, right, I know that's not the ceiling on my potential. So maybe I'm now capable of something even better, but I now can't imagine what that thing is because I don't have the evidence for it. And focusing on progress, I think, is interesting. How do we connect that with this idea of, reaching my future potential?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think embedded in that question are several questions as well. So there are some sports that are sort of endurance sports that, essentially you have to be out there for miles and miles and miles and hours and hours and hours doing the same thing over and over again. That gives you a lot of time to think.
Yes, it does.
And so
For better or worse.
better or for worse. Usually it's for worse, but that's essentially like what you're describing is that you have this companion with you, who is this internal, voice trying to guide you on whether or not you should persist longer and push harder, especially when you're doing many hours of training. The question is is the utility value of the incrementally added time and effort worth it? So again, we're rational creatures. We have to make these decisions because when we invest in one thing, we're divesting from something else. It could be family time, it could be leisure time, it could be business, it could be whatever. And so our brains have to make these decisions because with limited resources, we have to decide what's the best bang for our buck.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where mindsets come in. It's like, they try to answer the question of what's the point? Right? Like,
yes.
Will I achieve what I think is out there, what I think is beyond what I have any evidence for, which is this potential concept that you're talking about. And just how far can I achieve? Like, especially if you're thinking about going, semi-pro, pro, now you're getting at the levels where you really do have to make a very significant investment. And the only reason why you would do that is you have to have a glimmer of hope that you could be competitive at those higher levels. And so I think there's a couple of things. One is you're going to have this sort of companion with you that is always making these calculations. And that's where I think we get to some of the aspects of your earlier questions around how is it that we can foster a more resilient and adaptive mindset for ourselves. And I think going back, so there's many strategies, but one of which is just remembering that from a data-driven perspective, that unless you have some kind of physical situation that might be a viable reason why there are limitations to what you could achieve, which for the vast majority of people is not the case. And even when you think you have one, oftentimes you don't actually, it's not as bad as you think. I'm not making any sort of blanket medical statements here, but I'm saying it's that even let's say for me, who's I have short legs, for instance, right? It's the notion that I can't run as fast as someone with longer legs is actually not founded because when you look at the elite runners, they come in all sizes and shapes. But we use these sort of excuses and we use these conditions as convenient ways to disengage and distance ourselves. So there is a component of sort of the mindset training where you just have to start off with an awareness of what is the chatter in my mind. Because I think oftentimes it's there so often that we take it for granted that it has a certain tone, it has a certain personality, it has a certain consistency of showing up, especially when things are hard or when things are good. So just getting to know this voice and recognizing that that voice is not you. It is part of this sort of mechanism to try to understand the world in which we navigate. And so it's a personality, it's a component of our meaning-making machine, but it's not you in its entirety. And so the first step is just get an awareness. When it happens, when it pops in, just try to listen to it and then understand how it's speaking to you. Once you've had enough exposure to what the tone and the content of this voice is, then maybe you can start to challenge it. Right? Maybe you can start to say, I know that when I'm at the top of a climb on a hill, that you're telling me that my legs are too tired to keep pushing. Is that really true? And I wonder if I can challenge that. I wonder if next time I feel that or experience that, maybe I can now override that voice and push myself a little bit harder than I thought, and then recalibrate based on the data. If the voice was right and I couldn't, well, that's useful to know. But if I could, then maybe now you're starting to put little sort of kinks in the armor of this fixed mindset. And so I think that's a big sort of domain of strategies that you can start to employ by first understanding what is this voice and how do I challenge it based on data and evidence. And, going back to where I started, which is to say that like, unless there's like a viable physical limitation, there is so much potential for growth in a physiological sense that when we look at even the top performers, I would wager that any one of us could get within the 90th percentile of their performances in any given sport if we put in the adequate time on training. But obviously, time and training is not to be taken for granted because those who do reach the top echelons of their sport have invested a whole lifetime. But if you are in the middle of that sort of training regimen and program and lifestyle, and you're trying to figure out, can I get to that 90th percentile? I would wager that you can if you follow the same kinds of historical training programs that those athletes have. So I think A is like, be aware. B is try to like find ways to challenge it. And then C is like also recognizing that with mindset, it often pops up when things are hard, but you also have to try to create counter evidence when things are good. So when you do achieve a good outcome, like let's say you're able to achieve that milestone performance that you were talking about for the first time. Sometimes what people do is they discount that. They say, okay, this was just like a fluke. It was an easy course. No, nobody else was competitive enough there. But that's one of the ways that our brains actually fail us in a pretty consistent way. And one of the analogies that I love, and I'm, with the sport that I spend most time doing is running. But the fascinating observation from running is like, especially if you're in a race, while you're running, especially a longer race, after about 10, 15 minutes, you're kind of going to settle into a pace. And at that pace, there's going to be a group of runners around you who are typically at a similar pace. And so you're typically around these people that you're hanging on to, trying to like match their pace. But from time to time, what happens? There's a person that comes from behind you and they pass you. And then another person comes from behind you and they pass you again. And then you're like, okay, I'm hanging on with some of these people, but then there's people passing me. And then even as you keep going, some of these people that you were hanging on to just take off as well. And so you only have eyes for the people who are in front of you or passing you. And so our brains, because of that, especially when we strive to achieve greater things than we have in the past, we're always looking and comparing ourselves to those who are better than ourselves. Because we only have eyes for what's in front of us. And oftentimes it's the people passing us. What we don't recognize is when we pass somebody, because all of a sudden they're out of our field of vision. They're no longer part of the evidence that tells us that we're doing well. We also don't see the vast, huge groups of people who are behind us because we never started there or we passed them very early. So recognizing that our brains do have a bias for negativity, and when we're in competitive domains, we tend to strive to meet up or achieve at a higher level compared to those who are at that higher level. So comparatively, actually, we're set up to feel pretty all the time. Sorry, I'm not sure. Swear on the podcast. Okay. You can add that out.
Yeah.
But being able to recognize that again and sort of give it the empirical basis to realize that this is not really a true and comprehensive reflection of how I'm doing helps to recalibrate the sort of mindset calculation that happens in our minds, unconscious to our knowledge.
That's so interesting. This really tracks. I mean, I imagine we have that old saying, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together. And that these mindsets that we accumulate over time, either through our own self-reinforcing experience or from mindsets that we've encountered out in the world or an environment, that some of them become somewhat habitual. Like you said, if you are listening for this chatter, that there's a tone that you recognize because it has become white noise almost because it is so habitual. And what you're describing sounds like once you notice that and you can challenge it, you're interrupting a recursive thought loop that's been self-reinforcing and strengthening over time. And just by interrupting that, you can start to weaken that pathway and then potentially build a different one. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Unless you're able to sort of like disrupt those chatter patterns, then you're not going to recognize that they're really just a subjective interpretation of what's happening. And they're motivated. They're motivated by the pain that you're going through. They're motivated by the calculation, like, should I continue to invest all this time and effort? Like, they're actually part of a mechanism that's designed to
Right.
protect you. So it's not that they're bad. It's not, you shouldn't villainize those voices like, oh, you're invading and intruding my mind. They're there because they in some way kind of care. But at the same time, it's not the objective truth. And so if you have aspirations of pushing yourself, then recognizing that that is not the whole truth and injecting additional evidence that counters that helps to have a more balanced perspective. One sort of like phrase that sort of the mindset researchers I've had the privilege of working with have summarized, especially as you're thinking about like, if I can reprogram my mind, what is the value towards which I want to try to base that reprogramming? And the phrase that I come to over and over again is to move from prove to improve.
Ooh.
So if you're thinking about how it is that you want to like index on the things that matter in any moment as you're trying to calibrate, what is this? Why am I doing this? And the answer is either to prove to others that I can perform at a certain level versus that I'm here to improve and grow. Then that also helps to shift the meaning of or the reason for why you're doing things. So like if you're really pushing hard and you're not doing as well as you think you should be doing relative to others, then again, the rational choice is like, don't do this. But if you're pushing really hard and you understand that the reason why you're doing that is not necessarily to do well in this one particular training session, but continue to improve so that you can see what your potential is, then that becomes a very different story as well. So move from prove to improve is a phrase that I come back to as well.
Awesome. That's such a powerful takeaway. And I'm 100% going to use that for myself. I've never heard that before, but I love that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to touch back on this idea of the chatter not being, the chatter actually cares. I like that idea because one of the things I do when I work with athletes is I have them name the chatter as if it were a character. And I typically try to have them name it something that makes them laugh. So the one that I named mine is Regina, the character from Mean Girls, which she's a mean girl, but it also has this like funny, humorous connotation. And what that does is it separates the chatter, right? So it's not just me. There is this character.
Yeah.
And the character, especially if they have a funny name, you can take them a little bit less seriously. But also that the character, like you said, serves this really important purpose that's connected to our survival, because that character is saying, okay, our heart rate's elevated, you're breathing really hard. This is very similar to when we had a panic attack or when this other truly distressful, threatening situation happened. And that, Regina's going to come online. She's going to be like, whoa, 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 sound the alarms. This may not be a safe situation, or I've detected some kind of a threat. And Regina's interpretation of the situation may not be accurate, like you said, because Regina is detecting threat in the environment. And one of the analogies I like to use is like, if you walk around the corner and you see a hose, you might think it's a snake. Regina might think it's a snake. And she's going to make me jump before I have a chance to rationally assess the situation and determine that it's just a hose. And that's a good thing, because if it were a snake and I stopped to think about it and rationally assess the situation, I could be dead. So Regina is doing her job really well, but it takes my rational brain a second to come online and to challenge or, confirm or refute what it is that she said. And one of the powerful things I think about looking at the chatter or that character as serving an important purpose is we don't have to fight it. So instead of thinking like, oh, this chatter is bad, I have to overcome it. Now I'm not only applying effort to being aware of it and challenging it. And I think challenging it, like you said, is really important, but it's not a battle of wills. It's a cooperative effort, right? It's like, oh, hey, Regina, I see you. I can tell you're concerned about my breathing right now. I appreciate that you've got my back and you're checking out for threats. But right now, this is a hose and not a snake. But it removes this layer of, I want to say judgment and shame, like, oh, I shouldn't have this negative chatter. I shouldn't have this thing. no, it's actually a good thing and you can work with it versus feeling bad about it and adding this other layer that you then have to deal with as well.
Yeah. When do you find that Regina comes out most often?
That's another really interesting thing. Typically, when something that's happening it's an uncertain environment, it's high stakes, and the threat is maybe I'm not good enough. That's usually when she comes out. That's the threat, is that threat to my core identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that you're touching on here are really sort of transcending. And I believe that if you're trying to grow as a human being, then there's a lot of disciplines that are useful to be aware of. I've certainly been a huge beneficiary of the field of psychology, not just for professional purposes, but for my personal purposes as well. And some of the things that you're talking about is, moving towards a place of greater self-compassion, of greater self-awareness. These are the fundamentals of truly strong soul. And I think once you are able to cultivate the conditions and the qualities of a strong soul, then you can actually endure a lot more. But understanding the things that are making you brittle, making you vulnerable, are a significant part of that. And one of the things so first I'll share a quick quote that I love, and then I'll take a step back and get to the core of why we have these questions. But the quote that I love is, and one of the things I try to remind myself of, is that I'd rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener at war, which is to say that, even in this current day of comfort and leisure, that our brains are no longer designed to push ourselves to limits that are beyond what our conditions require, right? And so that we live in this sort of modern garden, if you will. And so there's no real reason to push ourselves beyond what's necessary. But what if it were necessary? And what if there were some value in having the skills and the experiences of someone who consistently is pushing themselves? So I think there's a component of who is the person that I aspire to be that you can sort of anchor your decisions around. And I think that's where goals are really important. Goals and aspirations are really important. They're there to serve a functional purpose of giving you something to strive towards, even absent the immediate contextual motivations to do so. So like I said, imagine that you live in a modern day garden. There's no reason to go and practice your sword skills, your running skills. But if that's who you aspire to be, having goals of qualifying for Boston, of meeting a certain competition time threshold, or being a stronger version of yourself, and those are aspirational components that can give you the motivation to keep striving. But in terms of just broader and more meaningful internal growth that is also at our disposal, it's what I've come to realize, and I apologize if this is a bit of a tangent to your podcast.
No, I love it. Tangents, we're all about tangents here. Go for it.
A lot of the big questions are that we implicitly are navigating around two things. One of which, is actually born of the fact that we are the single species, as far as we can tell, that have consciousness, right? So a consciousness, the way that I define it, is that at some point our brains became so complex for many adaptive reasons that it became aware that we are alive. And in that moment, I imagine two things happened. One was this incredible jubilation in the awareness that we are alive. Just being aware that you are alive must be such an incredibly powerful, positive experience. But at the same time, if our brain is as sophisticated as it is, immediately after that realization, you also realize that if we're alive, we're going to die soon. That becomes an incredibly terrifying experience. And so, a very, very sort of simplistic summary of the fundamental motivations of what drives us as human beings is understanding how to reconcile how it is that we can spend the time that we have been privileged with in a way that answers the following question: did I matter?
Yeah.
I think so much of what we do comes to how it is that we answer this question: did I matter? And oftentimes we anchor the answer to that question based on the signals and the feedback that we get from others. How did I do in math class? How did I do in my work? How did I do as a father based on the feedback my kids gave me? But as you evolve as a human, I think at some point you realize that the way that you answer that question is actually more anchored around your own internal calibration and values. How you determine whether you matter and whether your life is worth living are going to move from those external cues to a more internal place. And being able to navigate that journey and transition of understanding why we live, why we exert effort, why we push ourselves, anchored around the things, the values that really matter to us, then that becomes a pretty fundamentally sustainable pathway that allows us to endure the hardships of the external world, endure the doubts that come from the external world, and then invest in time and invest in efforts that are aligned with the things that we care about deeply and fundamentally. And once you're able to do that deep work, which is not
No,
easy,
it is not.
then you start to realize that, yeah, you really are like a good whole person, and the various components of you, but strengths, weaknesses, whatever you want to call them, are there for an adaptive reason. They're there to help you in some shape, way, or form. Even the limiting components of ourselves, like
Yeah.
Regina, or the fear to try something new. Those are all also there because they're components of what makes you so special and so unique. So, as you said, and I love it, is making sure that as you navigate these forces, internal and external, they come from a compassionate place, and that ultimately you are moving towards a level of self-awareness that is so resolute and so self-aware that you can endure almost anything,
Oh, that's
regardless of what the external cues are.
beautiful. I got kind of emotional as you were talking just then. That fundamental question of did I matter? Do I matter is so powerful. And I think, I mean, just the moment those words came out of your mouth, that I felt it in my chest. And I think that that really gets to the core of so much for all of us. And what you said about having that move from finding the answer to that question and moving from searching for that answer from these external cues to these internal cues, that really hit hard right now. And I think it's hit hard for me in a couple of phases of life where you move from school, where the outcomes are so clear. They're so quantitative. You got an A, you got a B, you got a C, you got a 90%, a 60%. It's so clear and cut. And there are clear expectations. It's quantitative, and it's all kind of set up in this pre-made system. You move out of that into college and it becomes more subjective. You move out of college into a job and it becomes more subjective. And I kind of feel like, for myself at least, and I know this is probably the case for others as well, you move through these periods of evolution where what you thought was going to bring you that fulfillment and meaning, that outcome that you thought, if I achieve this outcome, I will finally feel like I matter. I will finally feel like I'm enough. And maybe you achieve the outcome and you don't feel it. And then it's like, oh, okay, like that belief system, that mental model is crumbling, and now I need to find a new one. And I kind of feel like it's this constant shedding of old models and adopting new ones in search of exactly what you're describing, that fundamental internal resilience. I want to connect this back because in doing the research on and reading some of your material, you go into depth on what adaptive resilience really is. And one of the terms that you came up with, or one of the terms you mentioned, was grit mania. And I feel like that is such a great comparison with what you just brought up. Can you tell us what grit mania is?
Yeah. And it's not exclusive to grit. I think, there's historically a pretty clear pattern of where there's a concept that seems effective that we oversimplify it. So you can imagine, back, I think it was in the 60s, where there was this sort of simple observation that the individuals who had higher self-esteem also had better life outcomes. And so from that simple correlation, the field and the education domain all said what we need to do is tell our kids that they're great. They're just wonderful human beings. If they believe, that they are the simple greatest gift of God, then they will do well, because the correlation shows that higher self-confidence leads to better outcomes. Turns out that did not work out. Because if you create these sort of unfounded perceptions of great strength or great abilities that's not supported by the actual abilities, it can set people up for pretty disastrous outcomes.
I can imagine, yeah.
And so what follows from there was the growth mindset movement. In fact, Carol Dweck's incredible work on identifying these conditions and these qualities of individuals who see challenge and difficulty either in a positive light or in a negative light also was predictive of pretty powerful outcomes, right? So they showed that great growth mindset is predictive of better resilience, better engagement, better performance compared to fixed mindset. And so what happened is our educational systems, again, to a form, decided to try to scale the insights from growth mindset to every student. Now, the way that it's shared today, unfortunately, is this overly simplistic way where a teacher will, from the literature, say, hey, I know that having a growth mindset is good, so you should have one. Guess what? Not the best way. It's having a growth mindset, because what you're saying is now the onus is on you not only to perform, but also to demonstrate to me that you have a growth mindset.
Yeah.
Right? Like 15 years ago, the teacher who was neglectful of the kids that they didn't think were smart enough has now done engaging in the same neglect, but instead of based on what they think is skill, they'll neglect the students based on mindset. If you don't have the right mindset, I don't want to work with you. And so the same thing has happened with grit. Grit was this beautiful observation that those who have this persistence and commitment to long-term goals tend to have better outcomes. But it just caught a wave of popularity that was so fast and so rapid that we have again defaulted to an overly simplistic view. And unfortunately, we've painted this image of grittiness as being the foundation of being able to have these better outcomes, which I want to challenge, because if you unpack this simplistic notion of grit, you actually find a few components. So I think when people talk about grit, they say, pull yourself by the bootstraps. Or when you have nothing left to give, just dig a little bit deeper. And that's what grit is. But, from a physics perspective, that's not possible. When you have nothing left in the tank, you can't just make it appear out of nowhere. And so the unfortunate consequence of this sort of grit mania phenomenon that I term is that when things get hard, individuals believe that they just need to be a little bit more gritty, which interpret as I just need to find a little bit more of my internal reserve to push through this challenge by myself. And I think those components, implicit components of what we think about when we think of grit, are exactly the things that are actually the most dangerous. Because when you look at people who are resilient out in the wild, the people who can really endure and navigate challenge in the most adaptive way, they are the ones who are actually the least gritty based on that definition. Specifically, they're the ones that when things get hard from an early stage, they reach out to their network. They pull in resources to help them preemptively address the challenges that come their way. So as opposed to those who are gritty, who think, okay, I'm falling behind. I just need to sort of hide myself in my dorm room. I need to go to the track and put in a few more miles by myself before I can come back to the team or come back to the class and be able to tackle this as a group. But what ends up happening is when you do that, you either exhaust yourself or you engage in strategies that are not well supported. And so you're doing more work that leads to less optimal results, which in turn actually harms you. So that notion of grit can actually mislead people towards more negative outcomes because it confuses grit with resilience. And the way that I try to remind people of what resilience is and how you can foster resilience is not to foster the internal quality of resilience, but to foster resilient networks. Because ultimately, that's where the strength comes from. When you have nothing left to give, as we go back to that metaphor, then the only way you can find a little bit more is to borrow some from the people around you. And so when you invest in that and when you invest in resilient networks, then you too become part of that network of resilience, because sometimes people are going to rely on you when they have nothing left to give. And that's really the only way that I think we see resilience be adaptive in today's world. What I also want to just sort of say is because these terms are often conflated with a lot of different meanings, I'm not trying to suggest that you should just take life easy, right? Because some of the long-term pursuits that we have are challenging. They require that you persist in the face of difficulty, in the face of not getting immediate gratification. But those are distinct things. And I think to confuse them by saying the only way to get through things is to grind your teeth and push through by yourself is actually not adaptive. So I think if you're talking about, well, how do I then also cultivate time management? How do I also utilize goals to help me stay motivated for long-term outcomes? Those are important conversations and useful tools, but they're not grit. And that's why I think it's important to unpack it and think about them more specifically.
Yeah, I see this all of the time in sport. And this is such a great way of differentiating this, because grit is a word that gets tossed around all of the time in performance environments. And I think people ascribe to it many different meanings, but this meaning of just overriding, discomfort and tolerating more and more by yourself. And that certainly is what's implied, I think, is that you should just be able to handle it. And,
Yeah.
A few things happen with that. Not only do athletes and people, like you said, isolate themselves at the moment that they probably most need support from others, but I think that override itself is really dangerous too, because you're ignoring genuine signals that your body and your psyche are sending to you that need attention, that need tending to. And maybe you can't tend to them by yourself at this point because you don't have anything left to give. I love this idea of the resilient network because I think that is so powerful. And I think it's hard. It's hard to admit when you need help. It's hard to ask for help because I don't know the best way of saying this. This isn't quite the right word that I mean, but like it feels like you're burdening somebody else with like I'm just going to burden someone with my problems if I'm asking them for help.
Yeah.
How would you address those two things? The shame in feeling like I need to ask for help in the first place and the fear that I might be burdening somebody with that ask.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head. Whenever that emotion of shame creeps its head. In fact, that's probably the single most powerful distinction between when people decide to grind it up by themselves versus find a network. It's the feeling of shame. Like maybe me struggling is a sign that I'm not valuable to the team or I'm not doing as well. So going back to our self-awareness conversation, this single greatest, if I were to try to identify an experience that is not there to help you in this modern day and age, is this notion of shame that we experience. If you kind of go back to where the origins of shame come from, they come from like a conformity perspective, which is when someone deviates from the norms of the group, we use shame as a useful tool to bring them back in line. Now, a lot of the conditioning that we've been exposed to become internalized qualities such that, again, if you sort of extrapolate to why we feel shame from a performance perspective, it's because we grew up in an educational system that told us that you need to perform well. Otherwise, you're not good enough. We grew up in a society where we view athletic performance in a competitive lens, that you are only as good as you are relative to others. And so if you're struggling, we associate that with this notion of shame that we're not good enough. Right. So I think really being aware that that's where shame comes from, then that helps us also just again to be aware and decide when we can to kind of challenge that experience of shame and kind of override it. I think there are moments when you can override your internal programming. Just this notion of shame that I have to say, it's like one of the questions that a few colleagues of mine were talking about recently over drinks, which was just around parenting. And I tend to be more of a listener. I know you wouldn't believe this during a podcast. In social situations, I tend to just be the one who's absorbing and listening and learning, asking a lot of questions. So we were at this dinner table with a lot of my esteemed colleagues, and I was just going around and just trying to pick their brains about parenting, because that's the thing that was on my mind. And the conversation of social media came up. And as we know, I think the basic research shows that social media is not great, especially for young girls. And the reason is that it's not great is because of the constant presence of social media, there's what's known as this invisible audience that these young individuals feel, is that there's always someone who is watching them. And so they feel like they always need to be performing based on the standards that they see on social media. So for example, back in my day, when I didn't get invited to a party on a Friday evening, I didn't know about it until Monday morning, right? It means that I could spend my weekend actually like having a good time. But today, if you don't get invited to a party, you know about it right away. And so you have to live with this feeling of like, why am I not invited? Am I good enough? There's a lot of like shame in today's society, probably more so than I would say when I grew up. And so the question came to me where, after picking out my colleagues' brains, they asked me like, what advice would you give your children? And I said, you know what? I think if there's one bit of advice, is just what we touched on, is to have enough awareness to be able to recognize when shame creeps its ugly head and then tries to make you feel like you're less than, because that's what the function of shame is. And so once you become aware, and it's not an easy thing to do because it's everywhere and it's conditioned, it's internalized through many years of conditioning and social programming. But once you start to sort of see the moments where shame does appear, then you can start to engage in effortful and intentional challenging of those perceptions and with the hopes of replacing it. Just like having a fixed mindset. What you do is you recognize one of those fixed mindsets when Regina shows up and you're like, hey, Regina, thanks for being here. But like, what you're basing your assumptions on are not all of the data. It's not all of the evidence that we want to be considering. And shame is one of those feelings that I think is critical. And it goes back to this distinction between resilience. I think it's fine to push yourself. I think it's good to challenge yourself to a level that you haven't been to in the past. But if there's a notion of shame within that, then chances are you're going to resort to gritty behavior, which is this isolated over-efforting, as opposed to this adaptive resilience that I think is actually more adaptive for these.
Yeah, that really makes so much sense. And I think it also connects with self-compassion in a way, because one of the things that I observe is there's another belief, right, that reinforces the chatter, the Reginas out there, which is that I shouldn't be satisfied with who I am or how I am right now, because if I'm satisfied with who I am or how I am, I won't be motivated or driven or ambitious enough to achieve the outcomes I want to achieve or to achieve my goals. And I think sometimes self-compassion, as important as it is, gets discounted because there's a fear that self-compassion equals complacency, and that if I show myself compassion, then I'll become complacent, I'll lose my drive. If I don't have the Regina there, chiding me every minute of the day, I won't be driven enough to achieve the things that I want to achieve. And I think that sometimes we focus on grit. We maybe over-rely on these models to drive us to continue to persist when that might not be the most effective way forward.
Yeah. And I think the main message here is just recognizing that a lot of these emotional and psychological experiences that people talk about are not as monolithic as they might seem. So realizing that there is sort of a mixed set of emotions and beliefs. I'm not going to stand here and just say everyone should do this, right? Like some people actually do very well in their designated sport because of shame, because along the way they were told that's the only way that you'll matter. That's the only way that you be deserving of our affection. And that's not a great place, but I'm also not going to judge how people live their lives. I think at the end of the day, my hope is that people can make the choices based on as much self-awareness as possible, so that even if you do have shame and it's adaptive for you from a certain performance perspective, and you choose that that's what you want to use as a force of motivation, I'm not going to tell you no, but just be mindful that oftentimes shame is not as sustainable as a more enduring, more self-compassionate stance on why you do things.
How can self-compassion actually promote persistence?
Well, I mean, it's actually very because what happens when you stumble? You'll have self-compassion.
Yeah.
Right? The Reginas are going to come in and say, hey, you don't deserve to do this. You're not good enough. Who are you kidding? Who are you kidding? That's a phrase that we all hear in our minds, don't we? Who are you kidding? Well, you've got to figure out how to navigate that question. And if you have the intentional choice that I'm going to be self-compassionate, I'm not trying to kid anyone. I just want to do this because I want to grow. There are those moments when you do have to come in and have a conversation with the voices inside your head. And if you choose, that's actually one of the aspects of psychology that isn't as well researched, which is the power of choice, right? If you choose to do something, then there is that overriding possibility that can happen, right? If you choose to commit to a goal, then what you're essentially doing is you're overriding your protective, preserving instincts of sitting on the couch and eating fatty foods and, spending time in more pleasurable ways. But you've chosen to do something hard. And, there's actually a couple of muscles that I think about. One is this muscle of choice. So the more often you make choices and then follow through, the stronger that muscle gets. The other is this muscle of staying power. And I think, especially for endurance sports like cycling and running, there's the very specific strengthening of that staying power muscle that can only come by pushing yourself to do a longer run, a longer distance you've ever done. And those will be the places where your body is telling you, you're tired, dude. You need to go home. What are you doing? You shouldn't be out here. And you have to say, what I'm doing right now is I'm stressing a part of my body that isn't physiological. It's this mental staying power muscle that I need to be able to do an ultramarathon, that I need to be able to do whatever distance that you're trying to do. So I do think those are two additional muscles that if you add to your repertoire of muscles to strengthen in a particular domain, those are great. But again, be mindful of not letting shame or, these other stigmatizing experiences be the primary source of why you're doing that. So self-compassion is absolutely crucial, because I might decide to go for a really long run, and I might decide that I want to exercise this staying muscle when on that particular day, my Achilles is hurting, or I'm undernutritioned or underslept, and I just can't do it. So I come home and then I have to make a decision about, what does this mean? Does this mean that I just generally can't do this and I should be ashamed of myself because I didn't do what I said I would do? Like, should I have pushed myself harder? At some point, your preservation muscles actually do need to come in and protect you, because we can be crazy on the other extreme too, right? So yeah, I think self-compassion, I can't think of anything that would be an alternative to self-compassion that I would promote more.
Yeah. As you were saying that, I had this thought, which is, when we tell ourselves stories, right? So I've just gone out to do this long run. I want to push myself to run longer than I ever have before, or, this is a progressive part of my training plan. It doesn't go well. Maybe I come home. I am choosing, in a way, on some level, I'm choosing what meaning to assign to that event.
Uh-huh.
In my head, I also think that there's a part of me that would think, if I choose a meaning that's self-compassionate, am I lying to myself? Is there an objective meaning that, or are we making up all of the meanings? Because I think if we realize that we are really just making this up, all of it, there isn't an objective meaning, that it's then okay that you can choose the one that's going to be more beneficial to you. I think one of the things I struggle with is wondering, if I choose the meaning that's self-compassionate, am I letting myself off the hook? Is there another meaning that's true, and I'm just lying to myself about this?
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I love how deep you're going with all this stuff. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the art of self-awareness is. Again, like the particular recipe that I have might be different from what you do. But I think over time, as you sort of invest in this exercise of listening and conversing, and I do believe that the self-compassion acceptance has to be the foundation, because otherwise you're starting to sort of like create perceptions that are just false or fabricated. But I think at the end of the day, we all kind of know. We all kind of know what we're doing and why we're doing it. I do think we tend to be hard on ourselves, especially for people who aspire to do great things. Where that line is between that functional sort of challenging oneself versus finding the space to be self-compassionate, I don't really know exactly where that is for everybody, but I think being mindful of where that is for you as an individual is an exercise that over time you'll get better at appreciating and recognizing.
Yeah, that really resonates, because I think that there are moments where I know I could probably push a little harder and I'm not. Like, there is a level where if you're letting yourself off the hook, and then there are moments where I fear that I might be letting myself off the hook, but in my core, I probably know that's not true.
On that, I mean, we live in a day and age where that's why we have training programs.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Like, if we relied on our brains and our bodies to tell us what to do for each individual run, we would either like completely exhaust ourselves and break down our body to a point where we can't fully exercise for a program, or we just wouldn't get out the door often enough. Right. And having a well-designed training program with a thoughtful coach, or there's lots of services online, is actually really important. And baked into any good training program is a recognition that you're going to miss a few training sessions. You're going to be sick. You're going to have injury. And so they're not so brittle that they don't account for that bit of variance. And so I think a lot of this internal work can be outsourced to the training program, where you don't have to make those decisions. But if you are part of a training program and you're having a day where like you just need to give yourself some slack, then self-compassion can go a long way, because of recognizing that a good training program has that affordance of some variability baked into it.
And that connects back to having the resilient network too, because I imagine not just the training program, but the coach too, right? The coach can serve as a sounding board to help you kind of, make sense of and make meaning of what happened in your training session that day. And having somebody who has your best interest in mind can help I don't know, like reinforce it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one other thing I'll say is most of sports is a long-term game, right? Like if you're going to progress, you need to be in it for a long time, many, many, many years, right? And so I think, for the people who are just getting started, the first couple months, it's not going to be easy because you're gonna navigate a lot more of these demons. You're gonna navigate a lot more of these doubts because you've never done it, and your body is just starting to get acquainted to this level of stress that you're putting on it. For those who are middle of the road, you've had a bit of years into it, but you're also now trying to navigate like what is that equilibrium of how much more I want to put into it? Is it worth it? How far can I go? These are really difficult things to navigate. And then if you've been it for many, many years, you have to find an additional part that keeps you excited, that keeps you motivated, that keeps you pushing at that threshold of your ability. And so there's different challenges at different phases, but throughout all of this, without compassion, it's a long time to be living with a very negative aspect of your self chatter, right? And so I don't know that I would want to do that.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the research in this area because all of this is really fascinating. And so much of this is, we had a guest on who described these kind of softer, more nebulous topics as squishy. These are squishy concepts, right? Like they don't easily lend themselves to quantitative metrics or analysis. And yet, that's exactly what you do in the research. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges in doing this kind of research to tease out, maybe statistically or clinically significant differences or outcomes that you see in the research? And more specifically, what are things that folks can look out for if they are reading research and they are interested in pulling ideas from the research to apply in their own lives?
Yeah. I mean, one blanket statement I'll say about research and researchers is that, ironically, their job is to prove that whatever hypothesis they have is false.
Yes.
So that's what the significance testing, threshold is. It's like you have 95% chance of proving that this is false. And so they're actually in the business of falsifying hypotheses. What that means is that it's actually kind of hard to find a hypothesis that stands the threshold of the rigor of science. And so what that also means is it's actually kind of hard to measure a lot of things, right? So to your point, science around some of these implicit invisible forces is challenging. And the other reason why there's a challenge is that if and when there is a robust and consistent line of research that does surface, it lends itself to the other problem that we talked about, this sort of like mass scaling and overgeneralization of those concepts that then mute their potential. So now if you talk to a child about a growth mindset, like, oh yeah, I've heard about it 100,000 times. I know all about it. Right? You don't need to tell me about a growth mindset. I actually am the best of having a growth mindset. I happen to be the most skilled individual there has ever lived having a growth mindset. So it becomes challenging in that regard as well. But that being said, I do think in the field of psychology, I would even argue that despite the progress that we've made, that we're still at a very early stage in the field, that there's so much that we haven't yet understood, that we still have the potential of learning that is very powerful. I'll share with you actually a single point in my life that changed the course of my life, which was when I was a kid. My family was a refugee family from Iran after the revolution. So we had to flee the country. So we gave up all of our worldly possessions to come to North America with the hopes of being able to attain a better educational experience and, a better life in general. But that meant that we had to give up a lot of security. So I grew up in a very poor home. My parents were divorced from a young age. And so my mom was supporting me and my two brothers. I actually have four brothers, but two of them are relatively the same age as me. So my mom had to support all three of us with very little means in a country where she didn't speak the language, where she didn't have any experience to be able to transfer it into a career, which meant that she worked all the time. What that meant is that, oftentimes, because we didn't have the money to buy toys and I didn't have my mom around to entertain me, I would have to find ways to entertain myself. And from an early age, I was always curious. So one day I found the screwdriver, which was a very powerful moment because then I set about taking things apart
Oh.
so that I could understand how they worked. And it started off pretty innocently, like, door handles, hinges, tables, chairs. And then over time, it actually became a bit more sophisticated, things like radios and like other kinds of like complex things. I remember there was like a stationary bike I took apart. I noticed I'm just talking about taking things apart. I hadn't yet learned how to put them back together. Uh, but eventually it got to a point where I had taken apart this old washing machine.
Oh my gosh.
And in my mind, as I take things apart, I kind of try to figure out, like, well, how are these things working? And with the washing machine, I figured there has to be something that's driving with a fair bit of force, this turning of the drum. And so once I opened it, I realized that this massive drum was attached to this little motor through a belt, and that this motor would be the thing that's actually doing the work. So I took the motor and I actually opened up the motor, and I proceeded to like try to push the motor to see if it would start working. But despite how many times I pushed the motor, nothing would happen. It would just sort of like push, but then it would move, and then it would stop. It was only when I realized that this motor was attached to these wires that once you plugged it in, that's when things happened. And it was literally a shocking moment because I got shocked. At 9 years old, 120 volts of AC power can be a very life-changing experience. But that's when I realized that there's all this invisible force all around us. And really the thing that's the most powerful is not the physical components, it's the invisible forces that drive motivation, that drive power, and that drive us towards fulfilling our full potential. Things like love, things like aspiration, curiosity, aspiration. These are the things that I think are the realm of psychology that are the really powerful moving components of why we do the things that we do. Unfortunately, I think, psychology has a bias towards publishing things that are differences between people as opposed to commonalities. And those are hard to detect because of the significance testing requirements. And so there's a lot of fundamentals that we haven't yet fully been able to grasp, like the power of love, the power of aspiration, the power of dreams, that I think are immensely powerful motivators that we're still learning more and more about. But certainly there are aspects like growth mindset, like grit, like stress attribution that are well documented, that are also pretty resolute in determining how we do and what we do in our lives. If you're interested, there's actually a really interesting body of work by Alexander Rothman on the different phases of motivation. And he talks about when you're starting out a new particular pattern of behavior, that the things that excite you and drive you to do that behavior are very distinct from the things that keep you in that behavior. And so I think even just as you understand these basic principles, so just like really, really quickly, that research says that like we tend to be driven towards new behaviors by the possibility of new rewards. So like if you've never worked out, what excites you about working out is the vision of becoming this like really strong muscular person. But once you've been working out for a while, you're no longer as excited by that vision because you're there. But instead, what you're excited about, what keeps you motivated, is the fear of losing what you gained. And so it's like a maintenance motivational mechanism that's distinct from the initiation motivational mechanism. So I know I probably talk for another hour or so about just these different bodies of research that are really pertinent to performance, but I know we're also...
No, that's okay. I love that you just brought that up, because that is one of the things that I've talked to a lot of athletes about, is how the risk versus reward kind of ratio changes over the course of a career. Because in the beginning, you're new, you're a rookie, no one expects anything from you. So if you fall short, there's very small risk.
Yeah.
But the prospect of reward, of getting a great result, is very high. Then you have a lot of success. Suddenly now people expect you to win. And now the reward for winning is less because it's an expectation. And the risk for losing is so much greater because now you stand to disappoint people, whereas before there were no expectations. And it creates a really interesting, I say interesting, we'll also add challenging psychological component to sustaining motivation over the long term.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of things that are just rich and ripe with investigation that if you're interested in learning more about for your own performance, the research is out there. It's not always as accessible as it could be. So I'd welcome anyone to reach out to Amber. So I'm also happy to be connected anytime. This has been a really interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Omid. I want to end on one quick thought, which is going back very early in our conversation to this idea that our internal mindsets are informed by people around us, right? So environment and circumstances notwithstanding, our own internal mindsets are influenced by people around us. One of the things we talk about on the show are, mindset at the individual level, but we also talk about things that happen at the interpersonal level in terms of team dynamics, and then at the community level. And I think it's a really powerful point to kind of conclude on, to say, as much as we are influenced by the mindsets of the people around us, it's important to remember then that the reverse is true, right? The mindsets that we cultivate will influence our relationships, the people that we care about, our kids, our colleagues at work. And then that then expands out to the dynamics within a team, whether that's in sport or at work. And then that then expands out to the community as a whole. And so as challenging as this internal work is, it's, I think, important to remember that when you do the work for yourself, it's not just benefiting you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful, powerful message. And one of the things that resonates with my core value in this world of, how I think about how I answer the question of why I mattered, my personal philosophy is to be part of a community that's committed to growth. And so what you've created here, Amber, with this podcast and your messages feels very in line with that. And just want to thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise.
Dr. Fotuhi's last comment, that being part of a community that's committed to growth, is part of how he answers the question of whether he matters. Just, wow. I'm still blown away that our beliefs, even our unspoken beliefs, influence the beliefs and mindsets of those around us. And yet, I see this in myself, my peers, and my own kid. As a parent and a recovering perfectionist, I'm tempted to worry about making sure I have all of the right mindsets to avoid messing things up. But as Dr. Fotuhi said, it's about committing to growth together. It's not about getting it right or perfect or going it alone. We talk a lot about systems level change on this show, and to me, this is another example of a system we experience daily, but rarely name. We live within a system of interacting dynamic mindsets, ours and those of the people around us. We are literally and profoundly in it together. I personally want to give more thought to how I'm showing up in my life with a commitment to growth. How can we all be more aware of and intentional about our role in the system? What are some things we can do to seek out, build, or cultivate communities committed to growth? Something to ponder.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. This is an abridged version of the full interview. To get full-length and extended versions of each episode, sign up for a membership on Ko-Fi. Memberships start as low as $3 a month. Check out all the perks at kofi.com/beagoodwheel. That's ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel to sign up. The Be a Good Wheel podcast is produced by our wizard behind the curtain, Maxine Philivon. If you loved today's episode, don't forget to rate us 5 stars. Until next time, thanks for listening and thanks for being a good wheel.